Hi folks! This video is on another topic chosen by you, or chosen by the Cult of Musicology Twitter followers anyway. Is music a universal language? No. Okay, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Okay, there's obviously a longer answer, so let's get into it. Something magical happens when I encounter music from another culture that I don't know anything about, because it can be immediately accessible. Sure, there's likely to be things that I'm not familiar with, but there's also likely to be things that I can enjoy. This experience has led lots of people to generalise that music can be understood by anyone, like it were a universal language. I think of the proliferation of fridge magnets that say, "Where words fail, music speaks." Henry Wadsworth Longfellow asserted that music is the universal language of mankind. But is it really? Let's find out. Look in my eyes, what do you see? A cult of musicology. For me, the music as a universal language idea actually breaks down into three separate things. So I'm going to structure this video around those. 1. Is music a universal phenomenon? 2. Is music a language? And 3. Is that language of music universal? Let's start by looking at the people who would want to argue in favour of this question though. I would hope that for many of us, we're drawn to music because of its emotional power. We can be moved by, enjoy or dance to music without necessarily knowing its intricacies. What's more, we can listen to music composed by people who speak other languages, and we can still enjoy that music on a really significant, deep level. Several recent studies have tried to show that music is a psychological need of the human condition. This takes in a diverse array of different disciplines, including sociology, neuroscience, anthropology, and linguistics. But here's my attempt to sum up some of those recent studies. If we have a control group of listeners drawn from around the world, one key study covered 60 different cultures, and then we play those listeners a variety of music from around the world. Same study included 86 different musical cultures. The listeners could invariably categorise that music into its very broad emotional content or function. That content might be a love song, or a lullaby to rock a baby to sleep, or a song for dancing. From that, the researchers concluded that music was a universal language, arguably tying into some sort of underlying communication system across human cultures, our underlying psychological faculties. I'm going to come back to this study in a bit. Let's introduce my three questions. 1. Is music a universal phenomenon? Quick answer on this one. When I say universal, I mean, does every culture around the world have some sort of music? And the broad answer is yes, they do. In the same way that every culture has language. In the sense that every culture on the planet has some kind of organised sound that is held to have some sort of significance. That can be via singing, dancing, playing instruments, but every culture and group of people knows music. The question of what that music has in common is a different issue though, and what I'm going to come back to. Okay, question number 2. Is music a language? This is a much longer answer. Here, I'm working with this definition of language. That is, a system of individual signs or symbols that refer to concepts that, when put together via syntax, that is, a set of rules for combining those symbols, they can communicate meaningful concepts and ideas to another person. Linguists would probably say, no, music isn't a language. Authors like Steven Pinker are advocates of the idea that our psychological disposition towards music is a consequence of our evolution towards language. It's a slightly chicken and the egg kind of question about which came first, but most scholars seem to side that language came first. Pinker used the memorable phrase that music was auditory cheesecake. That is, a consequence of the human brain's evolution towards understanding tiny differences in spoken sounds, shifting towards perception of pitch and rhythm, but really not essential for evolution. We know that music can obviously communicate great emotions and feelings and can get us moving with the right rhythm. But does that make it the same as a language? Language has prosody. That is, it has melody, phrasing, stresses, and emphasis that helps us to communicate emotion. Some of these appear to be common across many cultures. When we're happy, we tend to speak in a higher pitch, in a faster tempo, and when we're sad, we tend to speak in a lower pitch, in a slower tempo, perhaps with fewer fluctuations of structure as well. If I listen to a conversation taking place between, two Turkish speakers, I obviously won't follow the exact meaning because I don't speak the language, but I might be able to surmise the intention following the spoken prosody because I can imagine what that would be in languages that I do speak. Person A is getting angry about something, person B tries to say sorry, person A refuses to accept their apology. We can imagine what the prosody of that conversation would be like in languages that we do know. In the same sort of way, we can follow the rough musical meaning of musical cultures that we're really not familiar with, because it might follow basic patterns that are similar to music that we do know. More interestingly, I think other music might use stock patterns in completely different ways. But that's another question for another time. Lots of the neuroscience of music and language overlaps, but our brains don't work in a simple this part does this part does that kind of way. Just about everything we do uses a complex combination of different parts of the brain. Given their evolutionary origins, it's not surprising that music and language fire up some of the similar regions of the brain, but this does not mean that music is a kind of language. Put it this way, German composer Richard Strauss claimed that any good composer should be able to set a menu to music. He never did this, of course, but think about it more as a sort of hypothetical. If someone wanted to make some music that was explicitly about a subject, like a menu, but with no non-musical content to suggest that, like a text or a program note, something explaining it, will an audience understand that intention? Or, another way, could I communicate something via music in such a way that any human being on the planet would be able to understand it? The short answer, time and time again, is no. Much of the most meaningful music that we hold to be significant is important because of a web of extra musical signifiers, the text of a song, knowing the biography or the context when a song was written, the memories from the times in our lives when that music really represents something for us, time spent with our loved ones, for instance. I'm not trying to downplay the meaning that music can have for us all, but it doesn't communicate those meanings in an absolute guaranteed way like a language can. In other words, it can communicate, but in a way that is quite different from a language. And question 3, probably the most important one, is the language of music universal? In European art music, you might often hear the phrase, a composer's musical language. We encounter metaphors like a performer's individual voice. That is, that the music includes signs and symbols that together make up a complex set of conventions and practices, assumed to communicate meaning that are individual to one composer or performer. For an example, take a march phrase. Imagine brass instruments, a snare drum, a 4/4 rhythm at a tempo that's comfortable to walk to. These things together have a socially loaded significance of suggesting the military or war. This is from a complex historical context that was also exploited by hundreds of composers for expressive effect over centuries of European music. Without knowing all of that baggage, though, that meaning would be completely lost. It's not communicated in the music itself. You have to know this stuff to recognise this meaning behind the music. And the same goes for pretty much everything that we might take for granted in music. The expressive significance of even particular instruments, or even singing. Here's one of my favourite anecdotes. Polish composer Grażyna Bacewicz, one of my personal favourite composers, I'm writing a book on her at the moment, she recalled going on a visit to India as part of a Polish cultural delegation in the 1950s. Together with performers and composers, they toured southern India around music schools and colleges. Everywhere they attended concerts, listened to talks, and also gave performances of music from Poland. Bacewicz vividly details one concert at a music school for teenagers where a Polish soprano classically trained, gave a concert. For the first 5 minutes, the students laughed almost uncontrollably, and then they quietened down afterwards. Confused, Batsevich asked the group afterwards why that was, why they were laughing. The students replied that they heard the sopranos singing as almost indistinguishable from screaming. They were laughing at just how absurd they found this style of performance, something that in Europe continues to be held as a kind of pinnacle of vocal production. And this makes sense. Consider Carnatic singing in southern India, the subtle and complex art of vocal production with intricate ornamentation. There's still a focus on projection and volume, of course, but culturally it has a focus on a delicate but controlled vocal technique. And really, questions about music as universal language come back so often to questions explored by ethnomusicologists, which is definitely a topic for another video that I'm going to focus on. This episode, this story from Batsevich, is an illustration of really what I mean. There are almost no universals of music between cultures, even down to tuning systems, divisions of the octave. The European tradition settled on 12 notes per octave, with quite a lot of grumbling about how to tune those different notes and no real consensus, but that's still a sort of rough standard nonetheless. So how to conclude, then? When someone wants to argue that there is a universal language of music, you ought to immediately pay attention to what music they're eventually going to say is the universal language. I've talked on this channel before about how in university music departments, all too often European art music is held to be the default. This is broadly true of claims about music being a universal language. That perhaps includes traditions of pop and rock, which themselves are embedded in some of the conventions of the European tradition, in the sense that they're generally played on instruments that were originally designed with that art tradition in mind, with important changes in scale, harmony, timbre, rhythm, etc., I should add. It's important to recognise that music is not a universal language, precisely because when we want to proclaim something as universal, we're at risk of immediately denying difference. To avoid that, we'd have to go to absurd abstractions of musical content if we wanted to generalise that, the concept of an octave is universal. What does that even mean in any sort of useful sense? So no, music is not a universal language. It doesn't mean the same things to all people across the world. Radically different musical gestures and techniques mean different things in different cultures. I stress I don't want you to think that this is dismissing the communication or the power of music. It's just that proclaiming something to be universal, as we learn from history, is all too frequently a colonialist project. We deny difference, we proclaim a hegemonic culture to be the default, and we impose onto everything else. If you enjoyed this video, please tell your friends and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.
Look in my eyes, what do you see? A cult of musicology.